The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Madisonville, Tennessee, making Grace Holloway flinch as she scrubbed the wooden floor of Madame Rossi's boarding house. She kept her head down, her threadbare dress soaking up the soapy water while her calloused hands moved mechanically across the rough planks. At 21, Grace had known little beyond poverty and hard work, but the determined set of her jaw belied the weariness in her hazel eyes. Zeke Blackburn stood in the doorway of the boarding house, his tall frame casting a long shadow across Grace's workspace. Dust from the trail still clung to his leather chaps, and his sun-bronzed face bore the marks of a man who'd spent most of his 30 years under the open sky. The year was 1875, and Zeke had just returned from driving cattle up from Texas, his pockets heavier than when he'd left. "Miss Holloway," he said, removing his hat. Madame Rossi around. Grace looked up, momentarily stunned by the cowboy's striking blue eyes. "She's out back, Mr. Blackburn." "Shall I fetch her for you?" "No need." He hesitated, watching her work. "That floor won't ever come clean, you know. Been stained with whiskey and tobacco juice since before the war." Grace sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of auburn hair from her forehead. "Perhaps. But Madame Rossi pays me to try." Something about her quiet dignity made Zeke linger. He'd seen her around town since he'd settled in Madisonville 3 years prior, always working, always alone. Rumor had it she was an orphan, taken in by Madame Rossi out of pity after her parents died of fever when Grace was 16. "I heard you're heading back to Texas soon," Grace said, returning to her scrubbing. Zeke leaned against the doorframe. "News travels fast in Madisonville." "Not much else to talk about," she replied with a small smile that transformed her face, illuminating features that had previously seemed plain and unremarkable. Her smile revealed a hidden beauty that caught Zeke off guard. "You ever been outside Tennessee, Miss Holloway?" he asked, suddenly curious about this quiet woman. She shook her head. "Never had reason to leave. There's a whole world out there." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. "Texas skies so big you feel like you might fall right up into them." "Sounds frightening," she said, but her eyes sparkled with interest. Their conversation was interrupted by Madame Rossi's return, her imposing figure filling the doorway beside Zeke. "Mr. Blackburn, welcome back. Your usual room is ready." As Zeke followed Madame Rossi upstairs, he found himself glancing back at Grace, watching as she resumed her work, that fleeting smile still lingering in his memory. Over the next week, Zeke found reasons to be around the boarding house: a loose floorboard that needed fixing, a squeaky hinge on the back door, a window that wouldn't latch properly. Each time, he sought out Grace's company, drawn to her quiet strength and the rare smiles that transformed her face. On a warm evening, he found her sitting alone on the back porch, darning a stocking by the last light of day. "Miss Holloway," he said, settling beside her on the step, "would you walk with me tomorrow, Sunday afternoon after church?" Grace's needle paused mid-stitch. "Mr. Blackburn, I don't think, just a walk," he assured her. "Nothing improper. We could stroll by the river." She studied his face, searching for mockery or ulterior motives, finding only earnest interest. "Why would you want to walk with me? I'm just a boarding house maid." "And I'm just a cowboy," he replied simply. "But when you smile, well, there's nothing just about it." The blush that rose to her cheeks made her even lovelier. "People will talk. Let them." Zeke shrugged. "I'd like to know you better, that's all." After a moment's hesitation, Grace nodded. "All right, Mr. Blackburn. A walk by the river." Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. After church services, where their sitting together had already sparked whispers, Zeke and Grace walked toward the Cumberland River that flowed at the edge of town. Grace wore her only good dress, faded blue cotton that had been mended several times but was clean and pressed for the occasion. "Tell me about your life before Madisonville," Grace said as they strolled along the riverbank. Zeke picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water's surface. "Not much to tell. Born in Virginia, but my family moved west when I was young, lost both parents to cholera when I was 15. Been on my own since, working cattle drives, ranch jobs, whatever paid." "I'm sorry about your parents," Grace said softly. "I know how that feels." "Heard you lost yours to fever." When she looked surprised, he added, "Like you said, not much happens in Madisonville without people talking. Then you know I have no family, no money, no prospects beyond scrubbing floors at Madame Rossi's." Her voice held no self-pity, just matter-of-fact acceptance. "What would you do if you could do anything?" Zeke asked. Grace was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, "I'd have a little house. Nothing fancy, just somewhere that's mine. I'd grow vegetables and flowers, maybe have chickens." She laughed suddenly, embarrassed. "It's not much of a dream, is it?" "It's a good dream," Zeke said seriously. "Honest." They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a bend in the river where a massive oak tree provided shade. Zeke spread his jacket on the ground and they sat watching the water flow by. "I've saved some money," Zeke said suddenly. "From the cattle drives, enough to buy a small spread outside of town." Grace picked at a blade of grass. "You planning to settle down then? Been thinking about it?" He turned to look at her profile. "A man gets tired of wandering eventually." "And what would you do with this spread?" she asked. "Raise horses. Good stock." His eyes lit up as he described his plans. "Build a proper house. Plant an orchard maybe." "Sounds lovely," Grace said softly. "It would be better with the right partner," Zeke ventured, watching her face carefully. Grace met his gaze, startled. "Mr. Blackburn, Zeke, please." "Zeke." She tested the name. "We've known each other barely a week." "I've known you longer than that," he corrected. "Been watching you for 3 years, though I didn't have the courage to speak to you properly until now." "Watching me?" She seemed taken aback. "Not in a troubling way," he hastened to add. "Just noticing how hard you work, how kind you are to the older boarders, how you never complain though Madame Rossi works you from dawn till dusk." He paused. "And how beautiful your smile is, on the rare occasions you share it." Grace looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "You're imagining things that aren't there. I'm just an ordinary girl with no prospects." "You're wrong," Zeke said firmly. "And I aim to prove it to you." Over the next month, Zeke courted Grace properly. He brought her wildflowers gathered from the meadows outside town. They walked together every Sunday after church. He fixed things around the boarding house, making Grace's work easier. Each day, her smiles came more freely, lighting up her face and confirming what Zeke already knew, that beneath her quiet exterior was a woman of rare beauty and strength. The town, predictably, buzzed with gossip. Why would Zeke Blackburn, who owned property and had savings in the bank, be interested in Grace Holloway, an orphaned servant girl with nothing to her name? Some suggested he was taking advantage, that his intentions weren't honorable. Others speculated that Grace was somehow trapping him, though how a penniless girl could manage such a feat remained unclear. 6 weeks after their first walk, Zeke found Grace in the boarding house kitchen, kneading bread dough with fierce concentration. "Grace," he said without preamble, "I want to marry you," her hands stilled in the dough. "What did you say?" "I want you to be my wife." He stepped closer. "I know it hasn't been long, but I know what I want, what I need." "Zeke, people will say you've lost your mind." Her voice trembled. "They already whisper about us. Let them whisper." He gently turned her to face him, not caring about the flour that transferred from her hands to his shirt. "I've never been more certain of anything." "But I have nothing," she protested. No dowry, no family connections, nothing to bring to a marriage. You have everything I need, he said simply. Your strength, your kindness, that smile that lights up the darkest day. Tears filled Grace's eyes. You can't build a marriage on a smile. Watch me, he challenged, then softened his tone. I don't need your answer today. Think about it. But know this, I love you, Grace Holloway, and I want to build a life with you. He left her standing in the kitchen, flour-covered hands pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with shock and something that looked suspiciously like hope. 2 days later, Grace found Zeke repairing a fence at the property he'd purchased on the outskirts of town. The land rolled gently away from the main road, dotted with oak trees and bordered by a small creek. It was beautiful in its untamed simplicity. She approached slowly, her shawl pulled tight against the autumn chill. This is your land, Zeke straightened, hammer in hand. It is. It's lovely, she said, looking around. Where will you build the house? He pointed to a flat area beneath a massive oak tree. There. Morning sun, afternoon shade. The creek's close enough for water but far enough not to flood the house in spring. Grace nodded, then took a deep breath. If I were to say yes to your proposal, would we live here? Zeke's heart raced. We would. I'd build us a proper home, though it might be small to start. I don't need grand, she said softly. Just solid. Like us, he ventured, setting down his hammer and moving toward her. Grace met his eyes directly. Yes, Zeke Blackburn, I will marry you. Joy surged through him as he swept her into his arms, lifting her off the ground in an exuberant embrace. When he set her down, her rare smile had bloomed fully, transforming her face into something so radiant it nearly took his breath away. See that, he said, tracing her lips with his thumb. That smile is worth everything. Grace and Zeke were married 2 weeks later in the small white church at the center of Madisonville. The ceremony was simple, with only Madame Rosie and a few of Zeke's ranching friends in attendance. Grace wore a new dress of pale blue calico that Madame Rosie had insisted on buying for her as a wedding gift. Zeke wore a clean black suit with his best boots polished to a high shine. As they emerged from the church as husband and wife, they were met with curious stares from townspeople who had gathered to witness the unlikely union. Whispers followed them as they walked toward the waiting wagon that would take them to their new home. Can't believe Blackburn's throwing his prospects away on that servant girl. What's he thinking? She brings nothing to the marriage. Heard she trapped him somehow. Give it a year before he regrets it. Zeke's jaw tightened at the comments, but Grace squeezed his hand. It doesn't matter, she whispered. We know the truth. As they reached the wagon, Earl Dawson, one of the wealthier ranchers in the area, stepped forward with a smirk. Blackburn, you've lost your mind marrying that pauper. What could she possibly offer a man with property? Several onlookers chuckled, and Grace's face flushed with humiliation. But before Zeke could respond, another voice cut through the crowd. You're all blind fools, said Hank Miller, an older cowboy who'd worked with Zeke on several cattle drives. He stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully toward Grace. They laughed when he married the poor girl, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. Well, wait till you see her smile. Worth more than all your gold, Dawson, and Blackburn here is smart enough to know it. Grace's eyes welled with tears as Zeke lifted her into the wagon. Thank you, Hank, Zeke said, shaking the older man's hand. Just speaking truth, Hank replied. Be happy, you two. As they rode away from the church, the whispers faded, replaced by the gentle sound of hoofbeats and the creaking wagon wheels. Grace leaned against Zeke's shoulder, her heart full. Your friend Hank is kind, she said. He sees people for who they really are, Zeke replied, squeezing her hand. Just like I see you. The wagon crested a small hill, and their new home came into view. It wasn't much yet, just a small cabin Zeke had hastily constructed with the help of friends, with a proper stone chimney and a front porch. But to Grace, it was a palace. "It's perfect," she breathed as Zeke helped her down from the wagon. "It's just the beginning," he promised, sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean, with a stone fireplace, a wooden table and chairs, a cooking area, and a curtained-off sleeping space. Zeke had placed wildflowers in a jar on the table, and the bed was made up with a colorful quilt. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackburn," he said, setting her gently on her feet. Grace's smile bloomed fully then, radiant and unrestrained. Zeke felt his breath catch at the sight. "See," he said softly. "That's what Hank was talking about. That smile could light up the darkest night." Winter settled over Madisonville with a blanket of frost and occasional snow. The newlyweds established a routine in their small cabin, Zeke working the land and caring for the 3 horses he'd purchased, while Grace kept house and created a home from their modest beginnings. To Grace's surprise, Zeke had been right about her smile. When they ventured into town for supplies, she noticed how people's attitudes began to shift. Her genuine happiness was evident, and as weeks passed, even the most skeptical townspeople had to acknowledge that the unlikely couple seemed truly content. "Mrs. Blackburn," called Mrs. Peterson, the general store owner's wife, one crisp December morning. "Could I interest you in joining our ladies' sewing circle? We meet on Thursday afternoons." Grace nearly dropped the jar of molasses she was purchasing. In all her years in Madisonville, she'd never been invited to join the respectable ladies' social activities. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Peterson. I'd be delighted." "Wonderful," the older woman beamed. "And please call me Dorothy. We're neighbors now." As Grace left the store, supplies packed in her basket, she marveled at the change. For the first time in her life, she was being accepted as an equal, not as an object of pity or scorn. At home, she found Zeke mending tack in front of the fire. "You won't believe what happened," she said, setting down her basket and unwrapping her shawl. "What's that, love?" Zeke looked up, smiling at her flushed cheeks. "Mrs. Peterson, Dorothy invited me to join the sewing circle," she laughed, amazed by the turn of events. "Me, with the fine ladies of Madisonville." Zeke set aside his work and pulled her into his lap. "Of course she did. They're finally seeing what I've always seen." "And what's that?" Grace asked, settling against him. "That you're the finest woman in Tennessee," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. As winter deepened, their bond grew stronger. They weathered a fierce blizzard that left them snowbound for 3 days, sharing stories and dreams by firelight. Zeke taught Grace to play checkers, and she taught him to make her mother's secret recipe for apple dumplings. In January, Earl Dawson's prize bull broke through a fence and wandered onto their property during a snowstorm. Zeke found the animal half frozen and brought it into their small barn, nursing it through the night. When Dawson arrived the next day, blustering about stolen livestock, he found his valuable bull alive and well. "You saved him," Dawson said, surprised by Zeke's actions. "Couldn't let him freeze," Zeke replied simply. "Any decent man would have done the same." Dawson looked uncomfortable. "Well, I appreciate it. If you need anything." "We're managing just fine," Grace said, appearing at Zeke's side with a cup of hot coffee for their unexpected visitor. Her smile was polite but reserved. Dawson accepted the cup awkwardly. "Mrs. Blackburn," he acknowledged with a nod. "Your place is looking well kept." "Thank you," she replied. "We're happy here." After Dawson left, Zeke pulled Grace close. "You handled that graciously," she shrugged. "No point holding grudges. Besides, I have everything I need right here." With the arrival of spring, their small property bloomed with possibility. Zeke built a chicken coop, and Grace started a vegetable garden behind the cabin. They added a lean-to on the side of the small barn and acquired 2 milk cows to supplement their growing farm. In April, Grace made an announcement that changed everything. Standing in their garden as the first shoots of corn pushed through the soil, she took Zeke's hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said, her smile more radiant than ever. Zeke stood frozen for a moment, then let out a whoop of joy that startled the chickens in their nearby coop. He lifted Grace and spun her around gently before setting her carefully back on her feet. "A baby," he repeated in wonder. "Our baby." "Due in November, the doctor thinks," Grace said, her eyes shining with happy tears. Zeke knelt before her, pressing his face against her midriff. "Hello in there, little one. Your mama and papa are waiting for you." The news of their impending parenthood spread quickly through Madisonville. To their surprise, it was met with genuine congratulations rather than the snide remarks that had accompanied their wedding. The ladies from the sewing circle organized a quilting bee to make a baby blanket, and Hank Miller carved a beautiful wooden cradle as a gift. Even Earl Dawson, still grateful for the saving of his prize bull, sent over a rocking chair for the expectant mother. "Figured you could use it," was all he said when he delivered it personally. As Grace's body changed with the growing life inside her, Zeke's devotion never wavered. He built an addition to their cabin, a small bedroom for the baby, and worked tirelessly to ensure they had everything they needed. When Grace experienced morning sickness, he held back her hair and bathed her forehead with cool cloths. When her ankles swelled in the summer heat, he massaged them gently each evening. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Grace told him one night as they sat on their porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "I hope so," Zeke said, his hand resting on her rounded belly. "Didn't have my own pa around long enough to learn all I should." "You have a good heart," Grace assured him. "That's what matters most." As summer turned to fall, Grace's time grew nearer. The baby was active, kicking and shifting at all hours. "Strong like its father," Grace would say when Zeke marveled at the movements beneath his hand. In early November, as the last leaves clung to the oak trees, Grace went into labor. Zeke rode into town to fetch the doctor and Dorothy Peterson, who had experience as a midwife. The hours that followed were the longest of Zeke's life as he paced outside their bedroom, listening to Grace's cries of pain interspersed with the doctor's calm instructions. Near midnight, a new cry pierced the air, the lusty wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Moments later, Dorothy opened the door, her face wreathed in smiles. "Mr. Blackburn, you have a son," she announced. "A fine, healthy boy." Zeke entered the bedroom on shaky legs. Grace lay propped against the pillows, her face flushed and damp with sweat, but wearing the most beautiful smile he'd ever seen. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in the quilt the ladies had made. "Come meet your son," Grace whispered as he approached. Zeke perched carefully on the edge of the bed, peering at the tiny red face. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes briefly, they were the same deep blue as his father's. "He's perfect," Zeke said, his voice choked with emotion. "Just like his mama." "I thought we might call him Henry," Grace suggested. "After your father." Zeke swallowed hard, touched by the gesture. "Henry Blackburn, it's a fine name." As the doctor and Dorothy departed, promising to check back the next day, Zeke stretched out beside Grace on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's tiny fingers. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed. "Never thought I deserved it." Grace turned to him, her eyes soft with love. "You deserve everything good in this world, Zeke Blackburn." "I have it all right here," he replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. My beautiful wife with her amazing smile, and now our son." The winter of 1876 passed in a blur of midnight feedings, diaper changes, and the wonder of watching their son grow. Henry was a good-natured baby who favored his father in looks but had his mother's quick smile. By spring, he was sitting up and babbling, reaching for everything within grasp. With a growing family came the need for expansion. Zeke hired 2 ranch hands to help with the horses he was now breeding successfully. Their small cabin became a proper house with the addition of another bedroom, a larger kitchen, and a proper parlor. Grace's vegetable garden expanded to include fruit trees and berry bushes, and her chicken flock grew to provide eggs not just for their family but to sell in town. On Sundays, the Blackburns attended church together, Grace holding Henry in his christening gown, Zeke beside her in his good suit. No one whispered about the poor orphan girl anymore. Instead, Grace was respected as Mrs. Blackburn, a successful rancher's wife and a valued member of the community. "You've proven them all wrong," Madame Rossi said during a visit to the ranch. She bounced Henry on her knee, delighting in the baby's giggles. "I always knew you were special, girl, but you've exceeded even my expectations." Grace smiled, that same transformative smile that had first captured Zeke's heart. "I just needed someone to believe in me first." "That husband of yours saw what was there all along," Rossi observed. "Smart man." As spring turned to summer, prosperity continued to bless the Blackburn family. Zeke's reputation as a horse breeder grew, bringing buyers from as far away as Kentucky. Grace's garden produced abundantly, and she began selling preserves and pickles that quickly became sought after in Madisonville. One evening, as they sat on their expanded porch watching Henry toddle after fireflies in the yard, Earl Dawson rode up the lane to their house. He dismounted, looking somewhat uncomfortable as he approached. "Evening, Blackburn, Mrs. Blackburn." He nodded to them both. "Earl," Zeke acknowledged. "What brings you out this way?" Dawson cleared his throat. "Got a proposition for you. My daughter's getting married next month, fancy affair. We're inviting most of the county." He shifted his weight. "Would be pleased if you and your family would attend." Grace exchanged a surprised glance with Zeke. "That's very kind, Mr. Dawson," she said. "Also," Dawson continued, "heard you've got some fine young stock. Thought I might take a look at that bay stallion I've heard about." "Happy to show him to you," Zeke offered, standing. "Grace, would you mind watching Henry while Earl and I head to the paddock?" As the men walked away, Grace scooped up her son, who had tired of chasing fireflies and was now rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Who would have thought, little one?" she murmured to the child. "Sometimes life surprises you in the most wonderful ways." Later that night, with Henry asleep in his crib, Grace and Zeke lay in their bed talking softly. "Dawson wants to buy the stallion," Zeke said. "Offered a fair price, too." "That's wonderful," Grace replied, snuggling closer to her husband. "Things have certainly changed in 2 years." "They have." Zeke stroked her hair thoughtfully. "Remember what Hank said at our wedding about your smile?" Grace chuckled. "He was just being kind." "He was being truthful," Zeke corrected. "Your smile changes everything it touches, including me." He propped himself up on one elbow to look down at her. "When I first saw you smile, really smile, I knew I'd do anything to see it again, to be the cause of it." "You are," she assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "You and Henry. You've given me more happiness than I ever thought possible." "And there's more to come," Zeke promised. "We're just getting started." As the years passed, the Blackburn family continued to flourish. Their ranch expanded, as did their family. In 1878, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret after Grace's mother. 2 years later, another son joined the family, whom they called Samuel. By 1885, The Blackburns owned one of the most successful horse ranches in eastern Tennessee. Their modest cabin had grown into a handsome two-story home with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. The property boasted a large barn, several paddocks, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and Grace's garden, which had become something of a local wonder with its variety of vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Henry, now 9, showed his father's affinity for horses and spent every possible moment in the stables. 7-year-old Margaret had her mother's quick mind and kind heart, while 5-year-old Samuel was a curious child who questioned everything. On a warm September evening, the Blackburns hosted a gathering to celebrate 10 years of marriage. The yard was decorated with lanterns, and tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by Grace and several neighboring women. Fiddle music filled the air as people danced and socialized. Hank Miller, now gray-haired but still spry, approached Zeke as he stood watching Grace laugh with a group of women. "She still has that smile," the old cowboy observed. "She does," Zeke agreed warmly. "And it still lights up everything around her. You remember what I said at your wedding?" Hank asked. Zeke nodded. "I do, you were right." "Course I was," Hank chuckled. "You were smart enough to see what really mattered." He clapped Zeke on the shoulder. "Not many are." Across the yard, Earl Dawson was engaged in an animated conversation with Henry about the merits of different horse breeds. The once skeptical rancher had become one of the Blackburns' strongest supporters and was now something of a mentor to the boy. "Your son has a good eye," Dawson told Zeke when he joined them. "Going to be a fine horseman just like his father." "He works hard," Zeke said proudly. "Gets that from his mother." As the evening progressed, Zeke noticed Grace slipping away from the festivities. Curious, he followed her to their favorite spot beneath the old oak tree where he had proposed all those years ago. "Hiding from our guests," he teased, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Grace leaned back against him, sighing contentedly. "Just taking a moment. Sometimes I can hardly believe this is our life." "Having regrets?" he asked, only half joking. She turned in his arms, her face serious. "Not a single one. Every day with you has been a gift, Zeke Blackburn. Even when I track mud all over your clean floors," he asked with a grin. "Even then," she laughed. "Though I'd appreciate it less if you did it again tomorrow." In the distance, they could hear their children's laughter mingling with the music and conversation. Their home glowed with lamplight, welcoming and warm. The night air was sweet with the scent of late summer flowers from Grace's garden. 10 years, Zeke mused. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to marry me." "Best decision I ever made, saying yes," Grace replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. When they returned to the party, Dorothy Peterson corralled them for a toast. The guests gathered around as she raised her glass. "To Zeke and Grace Blackburn," she announced, "who taught us all that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in love, hard work, and the joy of a genuine smile." "To the Blackburns," the crowd echoed, glasses raised high. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the children were tucked into bed, Zeke and Grace stood on their porch, arms around each other as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "What do you think the next 10 years will bring?" Grace asked softly. Zeke considered the question. "Henry will be 19, probably taking over more of the ranch work. Margaret will be breaking hearts all over the county. Samuel will be building some newfangled invention that none of us understand." Grace smiled at the predictions. "And what about us?" "Us?" Zeke turned to look at her, his eyes full of the same love they'd held a decade earlier. "We'll be right here together. I'll still be trying to make you smile every day, and you'll still be the most beautiful woman in Tennessee when you do." "Always the flatterer," Grace teased, but her eyes shone with happiness. "Not flattery when it's the truth," Zeke insisted, pulling her closer. "Remember what I told you when I proposed, that I could build a marriage on your smile." "I remember thinking you were daft," Grace admitted with a laugh. "Maybe I was." Zeke kissed her forehead. "But I was right." On a crisp autumn morning 15 years later in 1900, Zeke and Grace Blackburn stood on the porch of their home, watching as a carriage approached up the long drive. Their youngest son, Samuel, now 20, had returned from his first semester at university in Nashville. "Mother, father," he called, jumping down from the carriage before it had fully stopped. Behind him, the driver unloaded trunks and a strange-looking contraption. "What in tarnation is that?" Zeke asked as they embraced their son. "It's called a camera," Samuel explained excitedly. "I've been learning photography. I can capture images permanently on paper." Grace's eyes widened with interest. "Like a painting, but more accurate." "Exactly," Samuel beamed. "And I want to take a family portrait, all of us together." "All of us?" Zeke raised an eyebrow. That might be difficult to arrange on short notice. Indeed, the Blackburn family had expanded further over the years. Henry, at 24, had married his childhood sweetheart, Emma, and they had a 2-year-old daughter named Lily. They lived in a house Zeke had built for them on the northern edge of the property, where Henry managed the horse breeding operation that had made the Blackburn name famous throughout the South. Margaret, 22, had surprised everyone by becoming a schoolteacher rather than marrying young. She taught at the Madisonville school and boarded in town during the week, returning to the ranch on weekends and holidays. Her independence was unusual for a young woman in rural Tennessee, but Grace had supported her daughter's ambitions wholeheartedly. "I've already sent word to Henry and Emma," Samuel said, directing the driver where to place his belongings. "And Margaret knows I'm arriving today. I asked them all to come for Sunday dinner tomorrow." "Well then," Grace said, smoothing her apron, "I'd better start preparing. We'll have quite a feast to welcome you home." The next day, the extended Blackburn family gathered at the main house. The years had been kind to Zeke and Grace. At 55, Zeke's dark hair was now liberally streaked with silver, and lines fanned from the corners of his eyes evidence of a lifetime of laughter. Grace, at 46, remained slender and vibrant, her auburn hair showing only a few strands of gray, her smile as transformative as ever. After a boisterous dinner filled with stories and updates, Samuel set up his camera in the front yard, positioning everyone carefully. Henry stood with Emma and little Lily, while Margaret took her place beside her parents. Samuel set the timer and hurried to join the group. Everyone smiled. He instructed as the camera clicked. "That's easy enough for Mother," Henry joked. "Her smile is famous around these parts." "That it is," Zeke agreed, putting his arm around Grace's shoulders. "That smile built everything we have." "Oh, hush," Grace protested, though she was indeed smiling. "It's true," Margaret chimed in. "I still hear the story in town sometimes. How they all laughed when Father married you because you were poor, and how Mr. Miller said they should wait until they saw your smile." "Old Hank knew what he was talking about," Henry added. "Is Mr. Miller still alive?" Samuel asked. "I'd like to photograph him if he is." "Passed on 5 years back," Zeke said, his expression softening with remembrance. "Good man, Hank, saw the truth of things." As Samuel took several more photographs, capturing different combinations of family members, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a scrubbing girl at Madame Rossi's to the matriarch of a prosperous family, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. After the photography session, as the family relaxed on the wide porch, little Lily climbed into her grandmother's lap. "Grandma," the child said, patting Grace's cheek, "tell the story about your smile." Grace laughed. "Again?" You've heard it so many times. Please." Lily's own smile, so similar to Grace's, was impossible to resist. "Well," Grace began, settling the child more comfortably. "Once upon a time, there was a poor girl who worked very hard at a boarding house in town. She didn't have a family or fine dresses or anything that most people thought important. And then—" Lily prompted, though she knew the story by heart. "And then a handsome cowboy noticed her," Grace continued, her eyes meeting Zeke's across the porch. "Not because she was rich or important, but because when she smiled, which wasn't often in those days, it lit up the whole room. Like sunshine." Lily exclaimed. "Like sunshine," Grace agreed. "And the cowboy decided that her smile was the most valuable thing in the world, more precious than gold or silver or fine horses. And they got married," Lily continued, "but everyone laughed because they thought the cowboy was making a mistake." "That's right," Grace nodded. "They couldn't understand what he saw in a poor girl with nothing to offer." "But Mr. Miller knew," Lily said solemnly. "He told them to wait till they saw your smile. And were they sorry they laughed, Grandma?" The child asked, though she already knew the answer. "I think some of them were," Grace said thoughtfully. "But what mattered more was that your grandfather and I built a happy life together. We worked hard and loved each other, and eventually we had your father and your aunt and uncle." "And then me," Lily added triumphantly. "And then you," Grace agreed, hugging the child close. The newest Blackburn smile. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, Henry and Emma took a sleepy Lily home, and Margaret retired to her old bedroom upstairs. Samuel disappeared into the barn, where he had set up a makeshift darkroom to develop his photographs. Grace and Zeke found themselves alone on the porch swing, gently rocking as they watched the sun set over their land. "It never gets old," Zeke said, breaking the comfortable silence. "What doesn't?" Grace asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "This," he gestured around them. "Our home, our family, the life we've built." He turned to look at her directly. "Your smile," Grace laughed softly. "You and that smile, sometimes I think you only married me for it." "Partly," he admitted with a grin. "But I stayed for everything else. Your strength, your kindness, your remarkable ability to turn a house into a home." He took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band he'd placed there 25 years earlier. "I stayed because every day with you has been better than the last, even the difficult days." She asked, thinking of the drought that had nearly ruined them in '82, the winter when Margaret had pneumonia and they feared for her life, the economic panic of '93 that had tested their financial stability. "Even those," he confirmed, "because we faced them together." As darkness fell, they moved inside to the parlor, where a small fire took the chill from the autumn air. On the mantelpiece stood framed photographs their wedding day, the children at various ages, the ranch as it had grown. Samuel would soon add today's family portrait to the collection, another moment preserved for posterity. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken to me that day at Madame Rossi's?" Grace asked as they sat before the fire. Zeke considered the question. "I might have gone back to Texas, kept drifting, never known what it means to truly belong somewhere." He squeezed her hand. "What about you? Ever wonder what would have happened if you'd refused my proposal?" "Never," she said firmly. "Not once. I knew even then that you were offering me something rare and precious. Not just a home or security, but a partnership, a chance to be seen for who I really was." "And who was that?" he asked gently. "A woman worthy of love," she said simply. "A woman with more to offer than just a pretty smile, though that seems to have worked out well for us." Her eyes twinkled with mischief. "That it has," Zeke agreed, leaning forward to kiss her softly. "That famous Blackburn smile, passed down to our children and now to Lily. Who knows how many more generations will inherit it?" Many, I hope, Grace said, along with the story of how it all began. Outside, the stars emerged one by one in the clear Tennessee sky. Inside, the fire crackled peacefully as Zeke and Grace Blackburn sat hand in hand, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. 25 years had passed since a poor orphan girl had captured a cowboy's heart with her rare and radiant smile. 25 years of love and labor, joy and sorrow, building a legacy neither of them could have imagined when they began. "What are you thinking about?" Zeke asked, noticing Grace's contemplative expression. She turned to him, her smile blooming fully the same smile that had first enchanted him, now deepened by years of shared experience and abiding love. "I'm thinking that Hank Miller was right. My smile was worth something after all." "Everything," Zeke corrected softly. "It was worth everything." And as they sat together in the home they had created, surrounded by evidence of their shared life, neither Grace nor Zeke Blackburn had any doubts that they had found the truest wealth of all, not in gold or land or reputation, but in the love that had begun with a simple smile and grown into a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. In the quiet of their Madisonville home, as the century turned and a new era dawned, the story of the poor girl with the transformative smile and the cowboy wise enough to recognize its value lived on, a testament to the power of seeing beyond appearances to the true worth within.